remember the exact moment my life shattered. It was a Tuesday late afternoon. Sun setting over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in hues of fire and ash. My name is Alex, and on that day my father, a man I'd spent my entire life trying to impress, looked me dead in the eye and told me I was out. Finished. Done. He'd just sold his company, the one I'd poured my soul into for 20 years, for a staggering $400 million. And his first act as a newly minted titan? Kicking his only son to the curb. What I'm about to share with you isn't just a story. It's a raw, unfiltered journey through betrayal, obsession, and a desperate fight for justice. You might think you know what it's like to feel wronged, to be cast aside by the very person who should protect you. But trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. This isn't some made-up drama. This is my life, a life that went from hopeful partnership to devastating abandonment in a single gut-wrenching conversation. Everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and even myself was about to be obliterated. For 2 decades, I was his shadow, his right hand, his workhorse. From the dusty beginnings in a cramped garage in Phoenix, building circuit boards by hand, to overseeing a multi-state operation with hundreds of employees, I was there. I sacrificed relationships, holidays, my youth, all for our company, for our dream. I was the one who pulled all-nighters, the one who calmed the panicked investors, the one who navigated the cutthroat world of Silicon Valley while he stayed focused on the big picture. I believed we were a team, an unbreakable unit. I believed his promises of a future, of a legacy, of my legacy. Then, without so much as a whispered warning, he sold it. Not just a portion, not a partnership, but every single share. And the worst part? He did it behind my back. The day he called me into his lavish new office, the one with panoramic views of the entire city, I thought it was to celebrate. I imagined us clinking champagne glasses, talking about the next chapter, our next chapter. Instead, he simply stated, "Alex, it's done. The company is sold. And you're no longer needed." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like a death knell. My world, built on the foundation of his approval, crumbled around me. I felt a resentment so deep it burned. How could the man who taught me to ride a bike, who showed me how to tie my shoes, who instilled in me the value of hard work, just erase me? It wasn't just about the money, though a cut of $400 million certainly would have changed my life. It was about the betrayal, the absolute soul-crushing betrayal of being deemed disposable by my own father. I left that office not just heartbroken, but seething, a cold fury settling deep in my bones. I vowed right then and there that this wouldn't be the end of my story. It would be the beginning of his reckoning. I packed a small bag, threw it in my beat-up truck and drove. I drove east, away from the glittering lights of Phoenix, away from the echoes of his words, until the desert stretched endlessly around me. I found a tiny, run-down motel off Route 66, the kind where the neon sign flickers and the ice machine is always broken. I stared at the ceiling, the cheap wallpaper peeling in the corners, and plotted. My mind raced, consumed by one thought. How could I make him understand the depth of his mistake? How could I make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd inflicted? But then, less than 24 hours later, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Hesitantly, I answered. On the other end, his voice, usually so booming and confident, was now a ragged whisper, laced with panic. "Alex," he pleaded, "you have to help me. It's all gone. Everything." My father, the man who had just kicked me out and walked away with $400 million, was begging for my help, and in that moment, a chilling thought formed. This was my chance. My chance not just for revenge, but for justice. My chance to finally confront the man who had broken me, and perhaps, just perhaps, to reclaim what was rightfully mine. You see, what happened next was far more twisted, far more shocking than I could have ever imagined. The $400 million wasn't really gone, not in the way he thought. There was a hidden layer, a deception so intricate it would make your head spin, and I was the only one who knew how to unravel it. What would you do if the person who betrayed you most desperately needed you? Would you walk away, letting them crash and burn? Or would you step back into the fire, knowing it could either destroy you completely or finally set you free? The truth and the shocking secrets it uncovered will leave you speechless. The stale scent of old coffee and desperation clung to my clothes, a constant reminder of the life I was desperately trying to outrun. My name is Alex Thorne, and for the past 3 years, this run-down apartment above a perpetually noisy diner had been my sanctuary, or perhaps my prison. Every morning, the clatter of plates and the shouted orders would jolt me awake, a harsh symphony that echoed the chaos inside my own head. My days were a monotonous loop: sling hash at the diner, return to the cramped space, and stare at the peeling paint on the ceiling, replaying the moment my world imploded. That moment, the one that splintered everything, happened exactly 3 years ago. It was the day my father, Richard Thorne, the man who had always preached about family and loyalty, signed a deal worth $400 million and, in the same breath, signed me out of his life. He built Thorne Enterprises from nothing, a tech empire that promised to revolutionize how people connected. I had been there every step of the way, pouring my youth, my ideas, my very soul into that company. We were a team, or so I believed. I envisioned a future where Thorne Enterprises wasn't just his legacy, but ours, a testament to our shared ambition. I remember the day vividly. The air in his opulent office was thick with the scent of success and betrayal. Sunlight streamed through the panoramic windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, oblivious to the storm brewing between us. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, a predatory gleam in his eyes I'd never seen before, not directed at me. His smile, usually warm and reassuring, felt like a mask. "Alex," he began, his voice devoid of its usual paternal affection, "the board has decided a change in direction is necessary for this new venture. Your contributions are no longer required." My contributions? I had practically built the back-end infrastructure, pulling all-nighters, sacrificing friendships, even a relationship, all for Thorne Enterprises. My mind reeled, trying to grasp the absurdity of his words. "What are you talking about, Dad? We're partners. We built this together." The words felt hollow as they left my mouth, swallowed by the cavernous office. He simply leaned back, his gaze cold and distant, a stranger occupying my father's body. "Partnerships evolve, Alex. This is purely a business decision. Your shares have been bought out. You'll find a substantial severance package waiting for you." He gestured vaguely towards a thick envelope on the corner of his desk. "Substantial?" After years of blood, sweat, and tears, a severance package felt like a slap in the face. It was a dismissal, a cold, calculated eviction from the life I had known, from the future I had helped construct. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. My chest tightened, a searing pain radiating outwards. "You're kicking me out? After everything?" My voice was barely a whisper, laced with disbelief and a nascent fury. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer comfort. He simply watched me, his expression unreadable, almost clinical. It was as if I was just another line item on a balance sheet, easily discarded. I picked up the envelope, my hands trembling. The weight of it felt like 1,000 bricks. It wasn't just money, it was the finality of his decision, the severing of our bond. I walked out of that office, out of Thorne Enterprises, and out of his life, a ghost haunting the halls of my own past. The silence in the elevator on the way down was deafening, punctuated only by the ragged sound of my own breathing. The city lights blurred through the taxi window as I drove away, each one a pinprick of pain, reflecting the shattered pieces of my dreams. For 3 years, that resentment festered, a slow-burning fire that consumed my thoughts. Every news report about Thorne Enterprises' soaring success, every article praising Richard Thorne's business acumen, felt like a personal insult. He was living the dream we built, while I was serving lukewarm coffee, my hands still scarred from the late night's coding. The bitterness was a constant companion, a heavy cloak I couldn't shed. I knew with every fiber of my being that this wasn't the end of my story. This was merely the prologue to a reckoning. The universe had a strange way of balancing the scales, and I was determined to be there when the pendulum swung back. My life after Thorn Enterprises became a strange, bitter education. Every morning, as the diner's grease stained my apron, I'd scroll through the business news on my phone. Richard Thorn, my father, was everywhere. His face, beaming from magazine covers. His company's stocks soaring. His name synonymous with innovation and success. Each headline was a fresh cut, a reminder of what I had lost, what he had stolen. The $400 million he'd secured wasn't just a number, it was the foundation of a new empire, built on the ashes of my contributions. The resentment festered, a slow-burning fire in my gut. It wasn't just about the money, though that stung deeply. It was the betrayal, the callous disregard for the years I'd dedicated, the dreams we'd supposedly shared. He hadn't just fired me, he had erased me. I started noticing patterns, small cracks in the polished facade of Thorn Enterprises. Financial reports, even the public ones, seemed to have subtle discrepancies if you knew where to look. I remembered the intense, almost manic energy Richard had displayed in the months leading up to the acquisition deal. He'd been obsessed with securing that funding, pushing boundaries, even cutting corners, in ways that had made me uneasy at the time. My intuition, honed over years of working alongside him, screamed that something was off. The bitterness transformed into something sharper, more focused, an obsession. I began spending every free moment I had, late into the night, hunched over my ancient laptop, digging. The diner became my cover. While I was serving lukewarm coffee, my hands still scarred from the late night's coding, my mind was miles away, piecing together fragments of information. I remembered a specific, highly confidential project I'd been working on just before my dismissal. A new data encryption protocol designed to protect user privacy. Richard had been particularly insistent on its completion, even rushing the final stages. He'd called it a game changer, the key to securing the $400 million investment. Now, looking back, his urgency felt less like visionary leadership and more like desperate manipulation. One particularly rainy Tuesday, a new headline caught my eye. Thorn Enterprises announces revolutionary user data protection system. My blood ran cold. That was my project, the one I had poured my heart and soul into. The article detailed the system's unique algorithms, its impenetrable firewalls, all the features I had meticulously designed. But there was no mention of me, not a single word. It was as if I had never existed. The betrayal, already a gaping wound, deepened. He wasn't just taking credit for my work, he was building his new empire on it, selling my intellectual property as his own. That night, the clatter from the diner below felt like a personal assault. I couldn't sleep. The image of Richard's triumphant face on the news, juxtaposed with my current reality, fueled a raw, consuming anger. I remembered a hidden back door I'd built into the encryption protocol, a fail-safe in case of catastrophic system failure. It was a highly technical, almost undetectable vulnerability, known only to me. I had built it with good intentions, as a last resort, never imagining it would become my weapon. A dangerous idea began to form, a whisper of a plan. If he was going to erase me, I would make sure his empire crumbled under the weight of his own deceit. The next few weeks were a blur of caffeine and code. I wasn't just looking for discrepancies anymore, I was hunting for proof, for the smoking gun that would expose his fraud. I remembered a series of encrypted communications Richard had insisted on using for the final stages of the data protection project, separate from the company's main servers. He'd claimed it was for enhanced security, but now it screamed secrecy. My fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing digital footprints, following the faint echoes of those communications. I felt like a digital archaeologist, sifting through layers of corporate deception. Then, I found it. not on the public servers, but buried deep within a forgotten, rarely accessed backup drive I'd once maintained for him. A series of internal memos, dated just weeks before the acquisition, discussing the licensing of the new data protection system. But the licensee wasn't a third-party company. It was a shell corporation, registered in an offshore tax haven, with a single familiar name listed as its sole director, Richard Thorne. He hadn't just taken my work, he had legally, albeit fraudulently, sold it to himself, then presented it as a groundbreaking new asset to secure the $400 million deal. It was a brilliant, audacious, and utterly despicable act of self-dealing. The discovery hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just betrayal. It was grand larceny, a meticulously planned deception that had netted him hundreds of millions. My hands trembled as I reread the documents, the implications slowly sinking in. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about justice. He had used my genius, my trust, and my loyalty to commit a massive fraud. The resentment, the betrayal, the obsession, they all coalesced into a singular, burning purpose. I had the proof. Now, I just needed to figure out how to use it. The pendulum, I realized, was about to swing, and I would be there to guide its arc. The weight of those documents felt heavier than any burden I had ever carried, a physical manifestation of the deceit that had shattered my life. I clutched the folder, my knuckles white, the edges digging into my palm. Thorne. That was my name, and the name of the company my father had built, then twisted into a weapon against me. Every line of code, every design spec, every financial record I had meticulously compiled over the past few weeks screamed of his corruption. It wasn't just about my dismissal anymore. It was about the systematic dismantling of a company, built on the backs of loyal employees for his personal gain. My mind raced, a whirlwind of strategies, each one more audacious than the last. The initial shock had given way to a cold, calculated fury. I spent days locked in my apartment, the diner's cacophony a distant hum, poring over the data, cross-referencing, verifying. Each discovery was a fresh stab, a confirmation of the depths of his betrayal. He hadn't just kicked me out. He had systematically hollowed out Thorne Enterprises, selling off key assets at undervalued prices to shell corporations he secretly controlled. The $400 million deal that had supposedly secured the company's future was nothing but a smokescreen, a grand illusion, designed to mask his avarice. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was corporate. A betrayal of every investor, every employee, every person who had ever believed in the Thorne name. I remembered countless late nights, fueled by stale coffee and an unwavering belief in our shared vision. Now that vision was a grotesque parody, twisted by his greed. The resentment that had simmered for years now boiled over, transforming into an unyielding resolve. I wasn't just seeking personal revenge, I was seeking justice for all those he had wronged. I knew I couldn't go to the authorities directly. My father was Richard Thorne, a titan of industry, a man with connections that reached into the highest echelons of power. My word against his would be dismissed as the bitter ramblings of a disgruntled former employee. I needed leverage, irrefutable proof that would force his hand, expose his lies, and dismantle his empire from the inside out. The pendulum, I had vowed, would swing, and I was determined to be the force that set it in motion. My first step was to find an ally, someone who understood the labyrinthine world of corporate malfeasance, someone who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from seeing Richard Thorne fall. I thought of Sarah Jenkins. She was a brilliant forensic accountant who had worked for Thorne Enterprises for years before mysteriously being let go a few months before I was. Rumors had swirled about her asking too many questions, digging too deep into the company's finances. I had dismissed them then, blinded by my loyalty to my father. Now, I saw the truth. She had been on the verge of uncovering exactly what I had just found. Finding Sarah wasn't easy. She had vanished from the corporate world, seemingly swallowed by the very system she had tried to expose. I spent weeks tracking her, following faint digital trails, making discreet inquiries through old contacts, until I finally located her in a small nondescript office building downtown, operating as an independent consultant. The sign on her door simply read, S. Jenkins. Financial Services. It was understated, almost hidden, a stark contrast to the gleaming corporate towers she once inhabited. I walked in without an appointment, the folder of damning evidence clutched tight in my hand. The small waiting area was empty, the air thick with the scent of old paper and quiet desperation. A bell chimed softly as I pushed open the door. Sarah looked up from her desk. Her eyes, once sharp and inquisitive, now held a weary resignation. Recognition flickered in them, followed by a wary skepticism. "Thorne," she said, her voice flat, devoid of surprise, "I thought you'd be living it up on some private island by now, basking in your father's glory." I pushed the folder across her desk. "My glory ended the day yours did, Sarah. He kicked me out, and then I started digging." Her gaze dropped to the folder, then back to me, a flicker of something akin to curiosity in her eyes. "What is this, Alex?" she asked, her voice regaining a hint of its former sharpness. "It's everything," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging inside me. "Everything he did, everything he's doing, and everything we're going to do about it." She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the folder. I knew she understood the gravity of what I was offering. This wasn't just about money. It was about redemption, about exposing a man who had built an empire on lies and betrayal. The air in the small office crackled with unspoken tension, the weight of past grievances and future battles hanging heavy between us. I watched her, holding my breath, knowing that her decision would determine the next chapter of my life, and perhaps the fate of Richard Thorne's carefully constructed world. The pendulum was poised, and its arc was about to begin. Her eyes, dark and knowing, held my gaze. "Thorne," she said, her voice a low, gravelly whisper, "your father has always been a man who believes in self-preservation above all else. He's built an empire on lies and betrayal." The air in the small office crackled with unspoken tension, the weight of past grievances and future battles hanging heavy between us. I watched her, holding my breath, knowing that her decision would determine the next chapter of my life, and perhaps the fate of Richard Thorne's carefully constructed world. The pendulum was poised, and its arc was about to begin. She leaned back, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Your father's biggest mistake wasn't cutting you out, Thorne. It was underestimating you. He saw a broken son, not a formidable opponent." Her words were a balm to the festering wound of resentment I'd carried for so long. She then laid out a plan, a meticulous, intricate web designed to ensnare Richard Thorne in his own deceit. It wasn't about public shaming or legal battles. It was about exposing the rot at the core of Thorne Enterprises, a rot he'd meticulously hidden beneath layers of corporate success. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of anticipation. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice. Over the next few weeks, my life transformed from a monotonous loop of diner shifts and quiet despair into a clandestine operation. I met with her in hushed corners of coffee shops, in libraries, even once in a deserted park at dawn. She provided me with encrypted communications, burner phones, and a crash course in digital forensics. The task was daunting, to unearth the financial irregularities, the shell corporations, the backroom deals that had fueled Richard Thorne's meteoric rise. I spent countless hours hunched over a borrowed laptop, diving into a labyrinth of digital records. Each discovery was a fresh stab of betrayal, confirming the depth of his deception. He hadn't just dismissed me. He had built his empire on a foundation of ethical quicksand, and I was now holding the shovel. The deeper I dug, the more I understood the true scale of his duplicity. He'd systematically squeezed out smaller competitors, manipulated stock prices, and even, chillingly, used proprietary information I'd helped develop to gain an unfair advantage. My own fingerprints were on some of the very systems he'd perverted. The obsession that had simmered within me for 3 years now burned with a white-hot intensity. Thorn Enterprises wasn't just a company. It was a monument to his avarice, and I was determined to see it crumble. One evening, a cryptic message arrived. A single line of code that, when decrypted, revealed a hidden server. This wasn't just a server. It was a digital vault, a secret repository of his most damning secrets. Accessing it felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm. My fingers trembled as I typed, the hum of the laptop the only sound in the suffocating silence of my apartment. Then, it opened. The files inside were a goldmine, illicit contracts, offshore accounts, communications detailing his ruthless tactics. My breath caught in my throat. This was it, the smoking gun. Among the documents, I found a series of emails detailing a massive, illegal data harvesting operation. Richard Thorn had been secretly collecting and selling user data from Thorn Enterprises' most popular platform, a platform I had helped build, a platform he had always claimed was sacrosanct in its privacy policies. The sheer scale of it was sickening. He had betrayed not just me, but millions of users who had trusted his company. The betrayal felt personal, a violation of the very principles I believed in. My rage was no longer a dull ache, it was a roaring inferno. The next morning I sent the encrypted package of evidence to her. The reply was swift. Well done, Thorn. The first domino is set. The plan was in motion. The first phase involved a series of strategic leaks, carefully timed and anonymously delivered to key journalists, known for their investigative prowess. We didn't want a splash. We wanted a slow, steady drip of damaging information that would erode public trust and trigger an internal investigation. It was a war of attrition, fought in the shadows, using the very tools of information he had once wielded so effectively. The news cycle began to shift. First, it was whispers, then speculative articles, then full-blown exposés. The headlines didn't directly name Richard Thorn, but the focus on Thorn Enterprises' questionable practices was undeniable. I watched from the sidelines, a ghost in the machine, as the edifice he had built began to show cracks. The stock price dipped, then plummeted. Analysts began to question the company's ethics. Thorn Enterprises, once seen as an unassailable titan, was now a wounded beast, bleeding credibility. Then came the internal memo, leaked to a prominent financial newspaper, revealing a massive, unaccounted-for expenditure. The amount was staggering, enough to raise red flags with regulatory bodies. The article didn't accuse Richard Thorn directly, but it highlighted his absolute control over the company's finances. The pressure mounted, a relentless, suffocating force. I imagined him in his opulent office, the predatory gleam in his eyes replaced by a flicker of panic. He was losing control, and I was tightening the noose. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I received a frantic late-night call from her. "Thorn," she said, her voice urgent. "He's desperate. He's reaching out to everyone, trying to contain the damage. He even tried to contact me." My heart pounded. The moment I had been working towards, the moment of reckoning, was imminent. He was cornered, exposed, and vulnerable. The pendulum had swung, and its arc was about to deliver its devastating blow. I knew what was coming next. He would call, he would beg, and I would be ready. The phone vibrated, a persistent hum against the worn wood of my diner counter. It was an unknown number, but I knew. My fingers, accustomed to the grease and grime of 1,000 diner shifts, hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Thorn," I stated, my voice flat, devoid of any inflection. I heard a shaky breath on the other end, a sound that spoke volumes of desperation and a crumbling facade. "Alex?" The voice was a ghost of its former self, stripped of its usual booming authority. It was thin, reedy, barely recognizable as the man who had once commanded boardrooms with a single glance. "Alex, It's your father. A ghost of a smile touched my lips. A bitter, cold twist. I know who it is, I replied, my gaze drifting to the bustling street outside, where life moved on, oblivious to the drama unfolding in my hand. What do you want? There was a pause, a moment pregnant with the weight of his fall. Thorn Enterprises. It's in trouble, Alex. Real trouble. The investors, the board, they're turning on me. This new venture, the one I pushed through, it's failing. Spectacularly. His voice cracked on the last word, a sound that would have once torn at my heart. Now, it was just background noise to the clatter of plates. And you're calling me? I asked, feigning surprise. The son you cast aside? The one whose contributions were no longer required? The words were a scalpel, designed to cut, to expose the raw nerve of his hypocrisy. I made a mistake, Alex. A terrible mistake, he pleaded, his voice thick with what sounded like genuine remorse. I was arrogant. I was blind. I let the lure of that deal, the sheer scale of it, overshadow everything. I let it overshadow us. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing him in his opulent office, the very image of power and disdain. Now, that image was shattered, replaced by a man on the precipice of ruin. Funny how that works, I mused aloud, the irony not lost on me. When things are good, family is expendable. When they're falling apart, suddenly, I'm essential. He didn't argue. He couldn't. They're threatening to pull the funding. The whole deal is unraveling. I don't know what to do, Alex. You were always the one with the vision for the back end, the one who saw the flaws before they became catastrophes. You understood the intricacies, the vulnerabilities. My mind raced, not with pity, but with a cold, calculating satisfaction. This was it. The moment I had envisioned, rehearsed 1,000 times in the dark corners of my mind. The pendulum had swung, and that changed everything. He was at the bottom of its arc, bruised and broken. What do you need? I asked, my voice still flat, betraying none of the triumph that surged through me. I need you to come back, Alex, just for a few days. Help me salvage this. Help me find the vulnerabilities, patch the holes. If this collapses Thorn Enterprises, everything I built, everything we built will be gone. And I'll be ruined. Financially, reputationally, everything. The word we hung in the air, a phantom limb of a past that no longer existed. He remembered we now, when his empire was crumbling. And what's in it for me? I pressed, leaning into the phone, my voice a low, dangerous hum. A severance package this time? Or just another pat on the back before you kick me out again? His voice was a desperate whisper. Anything, Alex. Anything you want. Your old position, a board seat, shares, whatever it takes. Just please help me. I took a deep breath, the scent of stale coffee and frying onions filling my lungs. This was not just about revenge anymore. It was about proving my worth, not to him, but to myself. It was about showing him, and the world, that I was more than just a discarded pawn. Send a car, I said, my voice gaining a hint of its old authority. And make sure it's here in an hour. I'm not waiting around. He stammered his thanks, a torrent of relief washing over him. I hung up, a strange mix of vindication and a hollow ache settling in my chest. The game was far from over, but the first decisive move had been made. I was going back to Thorn Enterprises, not as a prodigal son, but as a force to be reckoned with. And this time, I would be the one calling the shots. The air in the Thorn Enterprises boardroom felt charged, thick with an unspoken tension that was almost palpable. Sunlight, once my father's ally, now seemed to mock him, highlighting the deep lines etched around his eyes. He sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, a ghost of his former self, his usual predatory gleam replaced by a defeated slump. Across from him, the board members, once loyal to his every whim, now shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting between him and me. I stood at the opposite end, not in the chair I had once coveted, but leaning against the wall, a silent observer. My presence was a stark reminder of the fragile balance of power, a testament to the fact that I was indeed calling the shots. "Richard," I began, my voice calm, almost dispassionate, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. "The numbers don't lie. This acquisition, the one you forced through, it's bleeding the company dry. The stock has plummeted, key investors are pulling out, and our most valuable assets are now liabilities." His face, usually a mask of unshakable confidence, crumpled. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. The betrayal, the one that had festered for 3 long years, was finally coming home. One of the board members, a woman named Eleanor Vance, who had always admired my father, cleared her throat nervously. "Thorne, with all due respect, your father has always had a vision. Perhaps this is just a temporary setback." I met her gaze, a cold, unwavering stare that silenced her. "A temporary setback?" "Eleanor, we're talking about the collapse of an empire. His vision has become a blind spot, fueled by hubris and a desperate need to prove something. He sacrificed everything, including this company, for a fleeting moment of perceived victory." My words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow. My father finally found his voice, a raw, desperate whisper. "Thorne, please. I made mistakes, but we can fix this, together, just like we always did." The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. "Together?" I echoed, a sardonic laugh escaping my lips. "You threw me out, Father. You discarded me like a broken tool. You said my contributions were no longer required. Do you remember that, Richard? Because I remember every single word. The memory of his cold dismissal, the shattering of my world, was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday." He flinched, his eyes pleading. I was under pressure. The board, they wanted a change. I took a step forward, my voice rising, no longer dispassionate. "Don't you dare blame them. You made that decision. You chose money over family, power over loyalty. You built this company on the backs of others, then kicked them to the curb when they no longer served your purpose." The raw emotion in my voice startled even me, but it was a truth that needed to be spoken. Eleanor, recovering her composure, spoke up again. "Thorne, what exactly do you propose? We can't just let the company fail." My gaze swept across the room, landing on each board member, one by one. "No, we can't. But neither can we allow the man who drove it into the ground to continue steering the ship." I paused, letting my words sink in, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. "Richard Thorne, you have a choice. You can step down gracefully and allow us to salvage what's left. Or you can fight, and I promise you, the fallout will be catastrophic, not just for the company, but for your entire legacy." My father's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, and finally, a profound sadness. He looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time in years. The mask of the ruthless CEO finally slipped, revealing the broken man beneath. He knew I wasn't bluffing. He knew I had the power, the evidence, and the resolve to see this through. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until he finally nodded, a barely perceptible movement. "All right, Thorne," he said, his voice devoid of all its former authority. "You win. A strange, hollow victory. I had achieved what I set out to do, brought him to his knees, but the satisfaction I expected wasn't there. Instead, a sense of weary finality settled over me. The resentment that had fueled me for so long began to recede, replaced by a bittersweet understanding. I had sought justice, and I had found it, but the cost had been immense. The emotional arc of my life had reached its climax, and now, a fragile resolution emerged from the ashes. Thorne Enterprises would survive, but it would be a different company, shaped by a different leader. And I, Alex Thorne, would finally be free to build something new, something truly mine, on my own terms. The game was over, and a new chapter, unburdened by the past, was finally beginning. The sterile conference room felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with unspoken accusations. My father, usually so composed, looked like a deflated balloon, his expensive suit rumpled, his eyes darting nervously. Across from him, the lead prosecutor laid out the evidence, piece by damning piece. Every illicit deal, every shell corporation, every penny laundered. It was all there, meticulously documented. I watched, a strange mix of vindication and sorrow churning inside me. This wasn't the triumphant moment I'd envisioned during those sleepless nights consumed by resentment, but a somber reckoning. He tried to deny it at first, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "This is preposterous! Fabricated! You can't possibly believe this nonsense!" But his voice lacked conviction, a hollow echo in the large room. The prosecutor simply smiled, a thin, knowing curve of his lips, and presented a recording. It was a phone call, clear as day, between my father and his business associate, outlining the very scheme that brought down his empire. The associate, it turned out, was one of the many I had quietly convinced to turn state's evidence, promising them a cleaner path forward. My father's face went ashen, all the fight draining out of him. He looked at me then, a desperate, pleading gaze, but I met it with a steady, unyielding stare. The betrayal had cut too deep, the scars too fresh. The ensuing weeks were a blur of legal proceedings, media frenzies, and the slow public dismantling of a legacy built on sand. The company, once a titan, crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. Assets were seized, accounts frozen, and the name Thorn, once synonymous with power and prestige, became a whispered synonym for scandal. I watched it all from a distance, no longer consumed by the need to be at the center of the storm. The obsession that had driven me for so long began to recede, replaced by a quiet sense of exhaustion. The path to justice had been brutal, leaving its own kind of wreckage. One afternoon, I received a call from my father's lawyer. He wanted to see me. I hesitated, picturing the man who had cast me aside so easily. But the lawyer's voice held a note of genuine urgency, not just professional obligation. I agreed, meeting him in a small, out-of-the-way coffee shop. He looked even worse than before, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. He didn't try to defend himself, didn't try to manipulate me. He simply said, "I messed up, Thorn. I messed up everything, and I'm sorry for everything." The words, simple as they were, hit me with an unexpected force. It wasn't the grand apology I'd fantasized about, but it was raw, and for the first time, truly felt genuine. He talked about the fear that had driven him, the constant pressure to maintain an image, to grow bigger, richer, no matter the cost. He spoke of the isolation, the way success had warped his priorities, turning him away from the very people who mattered. He looked like a man stripped bare, all artifice gone. There was no grand reconciliation, no sudden embrace, just a quiet acknowledgement of shared pain and broken trust. I didn't forgive him then and there, not completely. But something shifted. The hard knot of resentment in my chest loosened, just a fraction. The final verdict came down, a lengthy prison sentence. It was a stark, undeniable consequence of his choices. I didn't attend the sentencing. I didn't need to see it. The justice I sought wasn't about watching him fall. It was about the truth coming to light. About the system, however imperfect, working. The day after, I received a small handwritten letter from him. It was short, just a few lines. "I hope you find peace, son. You deserve it." That letter, more than any legal proceeding, brought a bittersweet closure. The victory felt hollow in some ways, the cost immense. But the constant hum of anger that had lived inside me for so long finally quieted. I had proven myself, not to him, but to myself. The journey had been destructive, but it had also been a crucible, forging a stronger, clearer version of me. The man who walked out of that coffee shop was not the same one who had been kicked out of his father's house. I was free, not just from his shadow, but from the consuming fire of revenge.